A rookie cop threw coffee on a black judge, claiming it was an accident, but his racist slurs exposed his true intent. What the judge did next will leave you stunned. The words hit like a slap, eliciting a collective gasp from the few onlookers who had gathered. The court clerk's face flushed with anger, her lips parting as though she was about to say something, but Nathaniel's subtle shake of the head stopped her. He wasn't about to let the situation escalate on Whitaker's terms. Instead, Nathaniel straightened his shoulders and folded the napkins neatly in his hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a fire that Whitaker didn't seem to notice. Without a word, the judge turned and walked toward the courtroom, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted as he passed, their whispered conversations beginning to ripple through the lobby. Whitaker watched him go, his smirk faltering slightly as he realized that the reaction he had hoped for hadn't come. He glanced around at the onlookers, some of whom were now shaking their heads in disapproval. The rookie officer shrugged, muttering something under his breath, and walked toward the exit, his confidence intact. For now. But as Nathaniel reached the doors of the courtroom, his hand resting briefly on the handle, a thought crossed his mind. Whitaker had made a grave mistake. And Nathaniel Brooks, a man who had built his career on justice and accountability, had no intention of letting it slide. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind Judge Nathaniel Brooks with a resounding thud, muffling the murmur of conversation still rippling through the courthouse lobby. The air inside the courtroom was markedly cooler, but the tension was palpable. Nathaniel strode toward the bench with measured steps, his expression calm but his mind racing. The incident in the lobby still played in his head, each word and gesture from Officer Whitaker etched vividly in his memory. It wasn't the first time Nathaniel had faced such blatant disrespect, but the brazenness of Whitaker's actions gnawed at him. Nathaniel knew better than to act out of anger. Years on the bench had taught him the value of calculated responses and the importance of maintaining control, even when confronted with outright hostility. If Whitaker thought his actions would provoke a reaction, he had miscalculated. Nathaniel wasn't going to let a young, arrogant officer set the narrative. Instead, he would let the courtroom and its protocols do the talking. By the time the proceedings began, the atmosphere in the courthouse had shifted. Word of the incident had spread quickly among the staff and attorneys, whispers of coffee and racial slurs passing from one person to the next. Nathaniel could see it in the way people moved, quieter than usual, their eyes flicking toward him with a mix of curiosity and concern. In the back row of the courtroom, Officer Ryan Whitaker had settled into a seat, his posture casual, almost defiant. He leaned back slightly, his arms crossed as though the room were his to command. His smirk lingered, though faint traces of unease flickered across his face when he caught the glances of others nearby. Nathaniel noticed him immediately, though he pretended not to. Instead, he began the day's docket with his usual authority, calling the court to order and addressing the first few cases with his signature clarity and impartiality. The room gradually settled into its rhythm, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Finally, Nathaniel paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom before landing squarely on Whitaker. The officer's smirk froze as Nathaniel's gaze lingered, the room falling silent as people noticed the judge's focus shift. Nathaniel's tone was calm, but carried an undeniable weight as he spoke. "Officer Whitaker," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet, "approach the bench." Whitaker hesitated. For the first time that morning, the confidence in his demeanor wavered. He glanced around the room as though searching for an ally, but no one moved. The silence grew heavier, the collective anticipation palpable. Slowly, Whitaker rose from his seat and walked toward the bench, his usual swagger replaced by a forced neutrality. Nathaniel waited until Whitaker was standing directly in front of him, the officer's posture rigid, his face carefully blank. The judge folded his hands on the bench, his expression steady as he began to speak. "This morning," Nathaniel said, his words deliberate, "an incident occurred in the lobby of this courthouse. An incident that, As a member of law enforcement, you should have taken every measure to avoid. Whitaker shifted slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides, but Nathaniel pressed on, recounting the events with precision. He described the moment Whitaker accidentally spilled coffee on him, the mocking tone of the officer's apologies, and the subsequent racial slurs that followed. Nathaniel's voice remained steady, but there was a quiet intensity beneath his words, a simmering resolve that demanded attention. The courthouse buzzed with the usual chaos of a weekday morning. Lawyers hustled between rooms, court clerks carried bundles of paperwork, and a group of police officers lingered near the main entrance, exchanging casual banter before their assignments. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the scent mingling with the sound of hurried footsteps and murmured conversations. Among the bustling activity, Judge Nathaniel Brooks stood near the entrance, his commanding presence impossible to overlook. Nathaniel, a man in his early 50s with graying temples and a sharp suit, exuded quiet authority. His years on the bench had taught him the importance of composure, a skill he had honed not only in the courtroom but in life. As one of the few black judges in the state, he knew that every move he made was scrutinized, every word he spoke dissected. Yet he had built a career on fairness and intellect, refusing to let the weight of bias undermine his work. This morning, like so many before it, he carried himself with dignity, chatting briefly with the court clerk about the cases on his docket. At the other end of the lobby, Officer Ryan Whitaker entered the courthouse, a disposable coffee cup in hand. In his mid-20s, Whitaker was new to the force but carried himself as though he had already earned the rank of captain. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his polished boots clicking against the tiled floor with each step. He was the type of rookie who believed that the badge on his chest gave him more authority than his training ever could, and his arrogance grated on those around him. Whitaker's gaze swept over the lobby, landing on Nathaniel almost immediately. The sight of the judge, calm and composed, stirred something dark and petty within him. It wasn't Nathaniel's reputation or rulings that bothered him. Whitaker barely knew of him beyond the courthouse walls. It was the very idea of Nathaniel, a black man who carried himself with undeniable authority, someone whose very existence challenged Whitaker's deeply ingrained prejudices. As Whitaker walked across the room, his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. His stride slowed slightly as he neared Nathaniel, his gaze fixed on the judge with an intensity that Nathaniel didn't immediately notice. The court clerk standing beside Nathaniel was mid-sentence when Whitaker deliberately quickened his pace and veered closer to the judge. Without warning, Whitaker stumbled forward, tilting his coffee cup just enough to send the hot liquid splashing across Nathaniel's chest and shoulders. The dark stain spread quickly across the fabric of Nathaniel's suit, soaking through to his shirt beneath. The judge took an instinctive step back, his expression shifting from surprise to controlled irritation. The court clerk gasped, her hands fluttering as she searched for something to help. Whitaker straightened up, his face a mask of exaggerated concern. "Oh, my bad," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Didn't see you there." Nathaniel raised his hand slightly, signaling to the clerk that he didn't need assistance just yet. He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, his movements deliberate as he dabbed at the stain. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his years of experience teaching him that silence could often speak louder than words. But Whitaker wasn't done. His voice carried just enough volume to ensure that his words would be heard by those nearby. "Guess you blend in too well," he added, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The comment hung in the air, its venom unmistakable. The clerk froze, her wide eyes darting between the two men. Around the lobby, conversations faltered as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Whitaker's smirk widened, emboldened by the attention. Nathaniel took a slow, deliberate breath. He had faced racism before, both subtle and overt, but the brazenness of Whitaker's actions was unlike anything he had encountered in years. He glanced briefly at the young officer, his sharp eyes scanning Whitaker's posture and expression. It was clear that the stumble had been anything but accidental. You people are always getting in the way of the real work being done around here, Whitaker continued, his voice laced with condescension. He tilted his head slightly, as if daring Nathaniel to respond. Nathaniel remained silent, his gaze steady but unreadable. The clerk, who had managed to grab a few napkins from a nearby counter, offered them to the judge with trembling hands. Nathaniel accepted them with a nod of gratitude, dabbing at the coffee stain with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside him. Whitaker's smirk grew as he leaned back slightly, his hands resting casually on his belt. "Guess I did you a favor," he said, his tone mocking. "That suit's too nice for someone like you anyway." As the judge spoke, Whitaker's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened and his gaze darted around the room as though searching for an escape. The lawyers and court staff watched in silence, their expressions a mix of shock and satisfaction. It was clear that Whitaker's earlier bravado was fading, replaced by the dawning realization that he had underestimated the man standing before him. "You see, Officer Whitaker," Nathaniel said, leaning forward slightly, "respect is not optional in this courthouse, and neither is accountability." Whitaker opened his mouth to speak, a weak protest forming on his lips, but Nathaniel raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The officer's protest died in his throat as the judge continued. "Your behavior this morning," Nathaniel said, his tone sharper now, "was not only disrespectful, but entirely unbecoming of an officer sworn to uphold the law. Your actions were intentional, your words inflammatory, and your presence here a disruption to the integrity of this court." Nathaniel's words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the room. Whitaker's face turned red, his confidence crumbling under the scrutiny of the judge's steady gaze. He tried once more to interject, mumbling something about an accident, but Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Enough," Nathaniel said firmly, his voice cutting through Whitaker's weak excuses. "This is not the place for half-hearted justifications. You are an officer of the law, and your conduct reflects not only on yourself, but on the institution you represent." With that, Nathaniel delivered his final blow. He announced that he would be filing a formal misconduct report against Whitaker, citing the racial slurs, the intentional act of spilling the coffee, and the subsequent comments as clear violations of professional standards. The judge's tone left no room for argument, his authority absolute. "Furthermore," Nathaniel added, his eyes narrowing slightly, "until this matter is resolved, you are not to set foot in this courthouse. Your presence here is no longer welcome." Whitaker's face turned a deeper shade of red as he sputtered in protest, his words incoherent and desperate. But Nathaniel remained unmoved, his expression unyielding. At a gesture from the judge, 2 courthouse security officers stepped forward, escorting Whitaker toward the exit. The officers' protests echoed down the hallway as the doors closed behind him. Nathaniel straightened his robe and turned back to the courtroom, his composure as steady as ever. Without missing a beat, he resumed the day's proceedings, his voice calm and authoritative as though nothing had happened. The room remained silent for a moment longer before the rhythm of the court resumed, the incident already becoming a part of its unspoken history. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It addresses themes of racism, abuse of power, and accountability, shedding light on the consequences of prejudice in positions of authority. Its purpose is to promote awareness and inspire change toward a more equitable society.